record? Perfect. Thank you. So, hello everyone. Welcome again to our data storage series. This week we're going to talk about relational data storage. So last week, Elias have done an amazing job talking about the no relation part of it, and this week I will be with you talking about the relational part of it. So I'm Vivian Paiva. I'm a data enthusiastic, deeply passionate about databases. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer like Elias and Sarah, and we are dedicated to empower our customers to leverage the full potential of our technologies. So we're happy to be here with you today and Elias to continue exploring these fascinating world of data storage solutions. Today, we're going to dedicate more time to understand the difference that we have when we are choosing the relational type. I wish that this session would be really insightful and enriching for you. So stay tuned, and I'm going to pass the word to Elias.
Good morning, team. My name is Elias Estevam. It was a pleasure to be here again. We had a good conversation last week. Again, as an MTT, Microsoft Technical Trainer, is empowering for us to be able to provide with these sessions and help you with your certification and with your knowledge. So welcome to the session.
Thank you, Elias. So just to have a really quick review of what we have covered last week. So I have uh, like already pre-populated the whiteboard here with the things that Elias already covered last week. So last week, Elias covered this part that's highlighted in yellow, even a little bit of relational databases about the Azure SQL Edge that is used for IoT solution when we need that local relational storage when, for example, we are gathering information in the IoT devices. About the unstructured data, so if we are storing PDFs, images, mails, we could use a blob storage account to place these files, for example. And even if we are talking about costs and these files are not really often accessed, and or we really don't need high performance when we are accessing them, even we could use the archive mode for blobs to minimize the costs. When we're talking about semi-structured data, so schema on demand, we saw there, like if you have Parquet files or JSON files, we could store them in a data lake, right? Gen 2 data lake. Elias showed us how to enable this functionality. It's also part of the blob storage account. We just need to enable that hierarchical namespace. And if we do that, what we can do, for example, it is to perform, right, analytical queries direct on these kind of files. For example, we could use signups pools like serverless pool or Spark pools to access the data in the raw format in the data lake. So that is brilliant, right? Could perform some analysis directly on the files. Then we also talked about like Cosmos DB last week. The focus of this week is relational data. So if I go here on the relational part, so if we talk about relational data, we can talk about, for example, about OLEP systems. What that means when we are um, dealing with operational data, transactional data that is used by our application, then which options we have to deploy our solution. So if we think about the solution that we have solutions that are under PaaS and solutions that are under IaaS. Then we're just going to put the options here and we're going to expand that later on. So for PaaS, we have open source. So we have Azure, MySQL, we have Azure MariaDB, and we have Azure PostgreSQL. Perfect. Then we have managed instance, and we have Azure SQL database. Then part of IaaS, we have Azure SQL VM. So it's just an instance of SQL Server running inside the Azure SQL VM. And we have any other DB engine running also inside the Azure SQL VM. So those are the options. So just going to pull a little bit like this. And now we're going to discuss a little bit about these options here. So PaaS. Yes. Yes. So PaaS is platform as a service. It's a fully managed service, versionless. We always get the latest version, for example, of SQL Server. If we are talking about the offerings of SQL, we have automated backups, patching, built-in business continuity, built-in high availability solutions, right? When we talk about IaaS, it is infrastructure as a service. So everything that's above the infrastructure, it's our responsibility. And there we have flexibility and also responsibilities. So if we want to minimize the overhead of maintenance, PaaS is a better solution. Okay, so I'm going just to place this here so we can expand the options that we have here. So to go here, I'm going to start with the easy one. The easy one is the IaaS. Part of the SQL family that we offering Azure, we have managed instance, we have Azure SQL database, and Azure SQL VM. Okay, so those are the options that we have for Azure SQL family. So if I go to the portal, here it is, and I go to the marketplace and I type Azure SQL DB, so Azure SQL, sorry, I get all of this option. And if I select Azure SQL, I go to create, then I get the three offerings. So this is IaaS, and those two are PaaS. One thing that I want to highlight, so Elias spoke about the disk. So when we are talking about Azure SQL VM, we are talking about disks, and he already explained that. So although we can get Ultra disk, SSDs attached to these VMs, one thing that I want to call your attention is when we create, so IaaS, just a side note, when we are working with IaaS, the same as our virtualized environment or on-prem environment, we have lots of flexibility to choose the version of SQL that we want to deploy, the operation system that we want to deploy. We need to build our own high availability solution at the database level if you want to offer that to our application. So lots of flexibility here. You can also access the operation system, but you need to do the patching, you need to do upgrades. That's is part of the responsibility that comes with IaaS. So I'm going just to choose, for example, these options here. I'm going to deploy a free license of SQL 2022. And
So,
I just,
sorry about, well, one quick question there, Vivian. So when you are choosing the virtual machine with the image, that means that the SQL is already in there. Can we choose the size and how many disks we want on that virtual machine, or it's already pre-configured for us?
sure, we can. So when we're going to create that virtual machine, so if I'm telling, so I'm using the marketplace image, so it comes as a pack with the SQL and the version of Windows that we pre-selected there, okay? But I can change other stuff there. And what I want to call the attention exactly is about the VM size. That is a really important um, aspect that we need to consider when we are deploying Azure SQL VM. Why? If we go here and explore the other sizes, we see here, just making sure that everyone, can you see it well here in the web page?
Yes, a little bit bigger would be, there we go, perfect.
Okay. So when we are choosing the size of this machine, so we are taking into consideration like the number of vCores, but when we're talking about the storage, we have here the number of disks that we can attach to this VM. That's related with the sizing and also the max IOPS that we get with that size. So imagine that I choose, for example, this one. I select it. And as we are using an image of the marketplace, so there is a IaaS extension for dealing with SQL configuration. I will be sharing with you soon that link. So you can set up some configuration at SQL Server level, so including the storage. So if I go to that possibility of enhancing, right, the storage configuration for SQL, if I go to the change configuration, you see here, I have a Primo SSD. The size does not support Ultra Disk, but let's say that I want to provision 4 TB of disk for this machine, but I don't want to provision a 4 TB disk. I want to provision, for example, 8 disks. So right now I have 1 TB. I want to provision, instead of doing that, I want to provision, for example, 8 disks of half gig. So I want to maximize my IOPS and my throughput doing striping. But look at the message. This VM size only supports 4 disks, and current I'm provisioning 9, right? So we need to be careful about the amount of this that's supported. And even though we see here that the maximum IOPS is going to be also limited by the size of my VM. So not going to talk much more about it because Elias have done an amazing job last week. Just calling your attention, if you are provisioning Azure SQL VM, just remember to take care of the limitations that come with the size of your VM. Okay.
And that configuration that we saw there for the managed for the IaaS, the virtual machine, that's only available on the virtual machine or the SQL Server. Can you do the same thing for like a managed instance, for example?
Manage instance is a PaaS service, so fully managed. So
Hmm.
that you just need to configure. The rest is going to be done by us as a provider.
Got it.
So the if you want to have this IaaS agent extension to get some extra functionality. So basically you are telling, I'm going to run a SQL inside this VM. You also can install it later. If you are not, I got that option from the beginning because I'm installing an image of SQL that is in the marketplace, and this is already there. But if you need to install that because you want to take advantage of other benefits of this extension, you can do it. I just shared the link in the chat. Does that answer your question, Elias?
Absolutely. Thank you.
No problem. So if we go back there, so let's expand a little bit more of information on the other options that is not IaaS, so fully managed service, part of PaaS. So we have Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance. So Managed Instance, it is when we want to, for example, remove the overhead of maintenance or the patching, all of this administrative work. And we need compatibility at instance level. So Managed Instance is a good scenario for the one that you want to modernize your applications, minimize the overhead of maintenance, and you need instance scoped functionalities available. So if you are using CLR, if you are using service broker, if you are using the SQL agent, so managed instance would provide that for you. For SQL database, we have more flexibility, so we have more option when we are deploying using Azure SQL database. But normally, for example, we don't have a SQL agent in a SQL database. So it's good when you want to modernize and you are create, especially a brand new database. You can take advantage of everything that SQL database offers you. And that is what we're going to do. Now we're going to explore Azure SQL database because we have more options when we go for this solution. Okay. So when we talk about Azure SQL database, first thing that we need to do, it is have a database server or what we call logical server. Okay. So what does mean that? That is going to be our endpoint of connection to get our databases. So our database is going to be placed on this database server. We do not provision resources to the logical server. The logical server, it is used for access management, like backup management, to define the kind of authentication that I'm going to allow to that databases, but we do not provision resources to the database server. So first thing that we need to do here, when we choose the Azure SQL DB, is to deploy a database server. Okay, we do not deploy any resource. We just need to choose the region that we're going to place this endpoint. Okay, about the deployment options for Azure SQL database. Deploy options. We have Azure, a single database, and we have elastic pools. Okay, those are the two options that we have when we go for Azure SQL database. And what is the difference? So a single database is when we have a dedicated database with its own allocated resources. Elastic pool, it is a pool of resources, so we allocate a resource for the pool, and we can add database that's going to share that that resources. So enables multi-database to share resources within that pool. So we allow efficiency of the utilization of that resources. So let's think that we have a multi-tenant scenario, and then we want to um, have right high performance because there are peaks during the day. Let's say that we work in different time zones. So depending on the time that we are talking about, we have peaks for that database, and we need to respond to that request for resources. So if I can add different databases that do not have concurrent peaks of utilization, I can then get better utilization of these resources. I will pay, right, for that pool of resources, and the different databases that are allocated to that elastic pool would be sharing that resource. Even I could set the min and max of the resource utilization per database. Important here is that the database that are part of elastic pools do not have concurrent peaks of utilization. Okay. A single database, we allocate the resources, and the database is going to have that, and we're going to pay always for that resource for that single database. Okay. Then just expand a little bit more on the purchase modules. So after choosing the deployment, we're going to talk about purchase model, and then we have two options. We have DTU and we have vCore based. Okay, so I'm going to expand here on the single database. We have DTU and vCore, and each of those, I will expand a little bit more of that, have one thing that's called servers here. And did you have basic, standard, and premium? While the vCore has general purpose, business critical, and hyperscale. So how about it? So when we want to deploy a single database, for example, we have to choose if we want to use the DTU model, purchase model, or if we want to use the vCore. What is the difference? So if we think about DTU, right, we are provisioning, so the performance is determined by the combination of compute, storage, and IO resources, which means you have less control over paying only for what you want. You cannot really choose. You choose the combination to give you the performance, but you cannot really choose granularly what you need. While the vCore purchase module, you can, for example, say, I want this amount of vCores. Super important. If I need to give you a device, really check the information about service tiers. That affects you, affects the performance, but also affects, for example, the high availability behind the service tier. So In PaaS, it's a fully managed service. You're going to only configure things. But when you configure it, you need to understand, right, the information. So I'm configuring using general purpose, but then I need to understand that, for example, let's see if it's here. I had somewhere over here, purchase modules, vCore. I had it open and then I cannot find. Don't worry, I can quickly.
Too much documentation.
Yes, I
So,
just want to,
a question there, Vivian. So if I
yes,
understand correctly, let's say, for example, if I have a dealership, right? I own 4 or 5 dealerships across the state, and I want a smaller database for each one of those dealerships. So a good idea would be for me to get like a pool of service, like in this case, a SQL DB with a pool, and then have each of the dealerships with a smaller database in that pool and manage in that style would be easier than separate databases.
yes. So it's going to be more cost effective, and also is going to be easier to manage that
Mhm.
databases. So especially if you have these peaks, depending on the usage, and those databases do not have that peak on utilization at the same time. So from a cost perspective and management perspective, would be the best option. Yes.
Awesome.
Okay. So again, here it is. It was in the documentation, but a little bit now. So what is the impact of the service tier? So as I said, we even need to be aware that it would impact, of course, right, on the amount of resources that you're gonna get. It's gonna impact the IOPS, the amount of storage that you can have there, the backup, but also if we think about high availability that's built in that database, if we think about a general purpose, we have here for compute nodes and the storage account, right? They are redundant and all of those, but they are detached. And if you think, for example, the architecture of business critical or premium, we are using to provision a business critical database using the infrastructure of always on availability group. So when you choose a business critical service tier, what we are doing in the background, it's provision 4 replicas of your database. Okay, and then there's even an option there, we're gonna go there soon, that you can even choose a zone redundant. So we even can place some of these replica in the same region, but in another data center. Super important to know that, because as you see the high availability, so if there is a failover, if we are using business critical, for this reason have higher SLA for business critical, because the infrastructure behind it, it is different from general purpose, for example. So this is really important information to take it into consideration when we are designing, not take only the part of performance, but also this possibility, for example, for high availability. You do not have to configure that. So just choosing business critical, this is going to be implemented in the background for you. So you're going to have 4 replicas in the background. And when we go to deploy, for example, Azure SQL database, um, and we choose here the compute and store. So I'm not choosing an elastic pool. I'm deploying a single database. And when we go to compute and storage, configure database is where we choose the service tier. So if we go to vCore, so I can granularly choose whatever I need, right? What I want to allocate to my my database. So if I choose, for example, business critical, look at that. I have even here an option to read from one of that replicas that is deployed in the background for you. And I'm not gonna pay more to use that one of that secondary replicas as a read scale out. So if it's enabled, for now I'm paying almost €1,000, but if I disable, there is no cost associated to this. So super, super helpful if you have some load that's just reading from your system. You could use that application intent read only to take advantage of one of these replicas that we use for giving you SLA for this kind of deployment. Other thing that we see here, if we are using business critical, so we can really choose the amount of cores that we want to provision, and choosing the amount of cores, see here, is going to change the max size of my database. So if I choose 8 vCores, I can have a database that's up to 2 terabytes, and the log space allocated, it would be this one. But if I choose 128 cores, I could have a database that is up to 4 terabytes, and I would have a 1 terabyte log space allocated. Now, if I go to vCore, for example, let's say the premium, that's similar to business critical, I can choose the max size, but look at that. I just choose the details. That is the combination of compute, storage, and I/O. So I have less flexibility here. So if I want to have that ownership, I want to have control over paying only what I need, it's better to go for a vCore mode. Other things that we have here that's interesting. So if we go for a general purpose, so availability there is a bit different. So here, now again, I'll always, here. Availability is a little bit different. So we have redundant nodes, redundant storage account for these kind of service tiers. So the availability behind it is a bit different. But what I get the possibility to have to select, let's say, two kind of computer tiers. I can choose provisioned that provides a specific amount of compute resource and is always there, or you have the option to choose serverless that provide us the possibility to auto scale based on the configuration that I set up here, right? I can auto scale and I can auto pause. So imagine that we have test environment, and my testers, the people that are working on that environment, only work 8 hours per day. So instead of having to pay all the time for this environment, if I provision as a serverless and configure the auto pause, so after a certain period of inactivity, I have only to pay for the storage. I don't have to pay for the compute. So it's a really interesting one. We have also like some demand that it's done only the 5 first days of the month. I have to have that data there, but we just do some analysis, or we just feed that database 5 days per month. So that also could be a possibility. Okay, so when we talk there, so just let's feed our um, whiteboard. So when we talk about general purpose, We also can have the computer tier, and then we have provisioned, and then we have the serverless option. So serverless allowed us more flexibility to auto-scale and auto-pause. Perfect. Now, it is, if we go there back, so if we go there and choose again, for example, business critical, I don't have the possibility to choose provisional and serverless because in business critical, we just have provisioned. Okay. Then we have another kind of service tier that's called hyperscale. Serverless right now, it is in preview, if I'm not wrong, for hyperscale. Hyperscale, it's a good choice when you need high performance and you are working with really large databases. So we saw there when we wanted to provision a database in the business critical, even getting the max amount of vCores, we can have only a database that max size is 4 terabytes. So if we want high performance, but those are large databases, so hyperscale would be our option. Okay, so this architecture is designed, okay, to provide you high performance for very very large database, even up to 100 terabytes. Okay, all of the infrastructure behind it give you support to have this kind of databases up running in this service tier. And then the one thing also that I want to talk is about the hardware. Even when we are um, provisioning Azure SQL database that is a PaaS solution, we get the chance to configure the hardware. So, for example, if there is some requirements that's about security and we need a special kind of hardwares like the DC series, how can we get that? Can we configure that? Yes. The only thing here again, it is not all of the service tiers is going to give us all of the options. So if we are choosing the hyperscale, we can configure the hardware configuration, and those are the options available, but not only the service tier. There are some hardware here that's only available in certain regions. So there we have to have those two things into consideration. If we really need a specific hardware, we need to think about the region that we are deploying and also the service tier. So these would be the offerings for hyperscale. And if we think about, for example, business critical, you see here, we have less options. Okay, so it is possible, right, to configure it, but we need to take into consideration the service tier and the region that we are deploying. Then just to give you a bit of information, so I'm just going to add here that we need to take into consideration the region and the service tier, okay? And of course, this option is available only if we are using the vCore purchase module. So if see here, if we had chosen the DTU, so let's go back there. We have less flexibility, so we cannot go in that level of detail. So just some overview. So if you are thinking of planning, right, your architecture, service tier is something that we really need to focus our attention to get all of the options that we need to comply with the requisites that our application needs. Then, just in this last 5 minutes, I just want to talk about a little bit about when we talk about OL. Why is not writing? That's OL. So when we are talking about analytical, right? Analytical data optimized for analysis and reporting. So we spoke a little bit here. If we have a Parquet JSON stored in a data lake Gen 2, we could access that information directly in the files, right? Optimized for analytical raw data. We could access using the Synapse pool. If we are talking about traditional data warehouse, and we are talking about PaaS solutions, we are talking about here Synapse dedicated pool. So if we are talking about a traditional relational database, we are talking about dedicated pool. So star schema, okay? So it's how we can achieve. So when we're talking about Synapse, we provision the DWUs, similar like we have with DTU. So that is going to also affect the performance. So when we want these environments that we are doing massive parallel processing, and we want to build this traditional data warehouse, what we have there, it is the Synapse dedicated pool. Okay. Would be the translation for traditional data warehouse. And I think with that, I gave you our overview of what we have for relational databases. Hope that this information would help you to build your solutions, and just highlighting again the importance of paying attention to the service tier, because that's going to have it's going to have lots of impact on performance, but also in the, for example, high availability. Now, if you want to expand that high availability, so if you want to build disaster recovery solutions, right? If we are talking again about Azure SQL database, can you deploy always on availability group? No, you cannot, right? So you cannot deploy always on availability group, but what you can do is to configure what we call replicas at database level and do failovers. Or if we are talking about Azure's managing and the Azure SQL database, if we go to the logical server or database server, we also could configure something that we call failover groups. So basically, this is how we configure this extra functionalities to support a disaster recovery or a business continuity plan, because this is about configuration, right? You configure and then we deploy that in the background for you. So I think we are good. I shared all of the information that I planned to. So any other questions before we close the call?
No, no question. I just wanted to clarify, but so with my understanding, right, is that If you want to just dive in, you are not quite sure about the size of your database, you can start with a DTU, get some amount of DTU. You want a little more power, you can go to the vCore. And if you want full control, just get a virtual machine and install a full-blown SQL server, and you can manage the way you do on-prem. Does that sound right? Like from a step up perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Lots of flexibility, but lots of responsibilities. When we have Azure SQL VM,
Mhm.
all of the management is on you. And then when you go to PaaS, manage instance is going to give you like a look, but it's a fully managed service, but you have all of the functionalities, like it's almost 100% compatible with a virtual environment or your on-prem environment in terms of what we offer you. And Azure SQL Database, we have lots of options to choose from. So if you think about service tiers, for example, we don't have hyperscale or we don't have DTU in the managed instance, right? So if we need flexibility, if we are building a brand new database, maybe we can take advantage of this strategy for Azure SQL Database.
Nice, nice. I love this. I love the non-relational and relational data.
Yes. Okay. So if no further questions, thank you very much for uh, watching or being here with you. Hope that this session was really insightful and help you to understand which options we have. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank you,
you.
team. And we look forward to more videos with you.
Yes. Stay tuned.